Welcome to Rubber Bellissimo at the Movies. This is a YouTube video podcast where we explore all things cinema. I want to welcome back to the show Nat Segaloff, who is a writer, producer, and journalist. He covered the film industry for the Boston Herald and CBC Radio, but has also variously been a studio publicist and film critic, college teacher, and TV producer. His previous books include Hurricane Billy, The Stormy Life and Films of William Friedkin, Arthur Penn, American Director, and Final Cuts, the last films of 50 great directors, in addition to career monographs on Sterling Siliphant, Wallen Green, Paul Mazursky and John Milius, and documentaries on Stan Lee, John Belushi, Larry King, and Sherry Lewis and Lamb Chop. Other books include A Lit Fuse, The Provocative Life of Harlan Ellison, nominated for Hugo and Locus Awards, More Fire, The Building of the Towering Inferno, The Exorcist Legacy, 50 Years of Fear, and Say Hello to My Little Friend, A Century of Scarface. And today we're discussing his most recent book, The Naughty Bits, What the Censors Wouldn't Let You See in Hollywood's Most Famous Movies. Nat, welcome back. This is the sixth visit in about 7 months, which is remarkable.
I should put Louie, my dog. You see him in the corner of the screen. Louie, eat your food. Come on, I work hard for this stuff. You're on royalties.
Yeah, he's got a book. He's got a book out a month, so that's you got to appreciate that.
Yeah, these aren't even interviews anymore between us. It's like two guys, two film geeks talking about movies, which is wonderful. Hi,
pretty
Robert.
much, yeah, pretty much. No, it's great. It's great to have you back, and of course, I really enjoyed the book. And on one hand, it was a frustrating read because, of course, as a film history fan, I've known about the censorship issues and the production code. But then when you really, I used to always know things from a general standpoint of what they did. But now with this book, having to go, I think I counted 54 movies. Yeah. And it's so frustrating to see how the littlest things and that they would send the filmmakers and producers pages of notes of changes that had to be made. It's amazing that anything decent has been made in that period with all the compromises, but at the same time it was still quite fun and entertaining to read about all the trouble.
They had to use ingenuity to get around the censors in those days, and they managed to do it. Also, you remember people attended the movies as a family, and so the adults would get things that would go over the heads of the kids, you'd hope.
Right. Yeah. No, that's exactly it. But the first thing I wanted to ask was, after we spoke about your other book on the production code, Otto Preminger versus the Censors, which I'll leave in the description box below if anyone wants to check out my interview with Nat on that, and that being about how Otto really pressured and strategically found ways to really crack the production code. Didn't bring it down, but he certainly made an impact at that time. And now another follow-up being The Naughty Bits. So I listened to another interview you did recently, and you had said that when you were doing that book, the Otto Preminger one, that's when the idea formed to do this one. So after having done two books about the production code and censorship, is there something about censorship that there's some kind of personal connection for you? I can't help but wonder.
Well, I used to work for broadcast television in America, and they were pretty strict about such things. And the thing I remember most of all, which doesn't apply to The Naughty Bits, but it's still a good story, is in 1973, I was working for an NBC station that was also owned by Westinghouse, and they were fairly restrictive. Now, The Exorcist was released, and I did a story on The Exorcist. And in those days, there were no film clips available, especially for an R-rated film. But since I knew William Friedkin, I asked him if he could maybe get me a scene from The Exorcist. And he sent me the one where little Reagan is fully possessed and her throat swells up and she says, "Keep away, the sow is mine." Now, I had clearances from Ellen Burstyn, from Linda Blair, from everybody, because Billy was very, very helpful. And it turned out it was the first time that scene was broadcast anywhere, especially on American television. And I was very careful to send copies of all of these permissions and to notify the management at WBZ TV in Boston that it was going to be on. at 7:30, which was the prime time access. Now, all of that is prologue to, at about 7:38, the switchboard lit up like the proverbial Christmas tree because we didn't know anything about an advisory, and the executives put my memos to one side. Had I not written all these CYA, cover your ass memos, I would have been not only fired but pilloried. But the executives were so concerned because we offended Catholic Boston with this movie about a possession. And it was fun putting it, but after that, they censored everything that I wanted to put on the air, including, as it turned out, a scene from a Woody Allen movie when he did Interiors. We and Roger Ebert were the only people who got film clips for that because I knew Woody at the time, and they wouldn't let it on the air simply because they couldn't vouch for it. There was nothing wrong about it. So yeah, I'm quite aware of censorship on a very personal basis, but not from my own creation, just from trying to get things on broadcast television. Of course, it's all changed now.
I see. Oh, interesting. I couldn't help but wonder. I'm like, I bet you there's something beyond interest here or fascination. There has to be some kind of direct experience. So I've done 2 books on censorship.
Yeah. That plus being on the board of directors of various ACLUs for 50 years, I'm really pretty much against censorship. But government censorship is one thing, but the movie self-censorship is quite something else. And that's why we have all these letters from the production code in the naughty bits.
Right, which is something I didn't know until I read, which you also mentioned in the Preminger book, that the government couldn't censor anyone, but a private enterprise could censor themselves. Sure. So places like YouTube now, you think, or Facebook and the movies, which is what they
can do it.
Yeah. What was it difficult to because I counted you have 54 movies that you wrote about. Was it difficult to narrow down which movies to target? To write about, I should say.
Well, yeah. Not every movie had censorship problems. I mean, I included The Sound of Music and The Ten Commandments in here. It's sort of like the people who ran vaudeville shows would bring a virgin out when they heard the Police Vice Squad was in the audience. Although, in fact, The Ten Commandments did have a tiny censorship problem. But I tried to go by the panoply of issues that were censored by Hollywood. You see, if I can go back for a second, in the 1920s, a series of scandals broke Hollywood in headlines all over the country. And the filmmakers, the studios, the moguls were afraid that there would be local censorship boards set up to cut movies. And the prospect of being able to having to make 100 different versions of every movie to fit the municipalities was something that they didn't want to do. So the film companies set up a lobbying group, which exists today. It was called at the time the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America. Now it's called the Motion Picture Association. And they installed a man named Will Hayes, who was a former postmaster general, who looked like he fell off a Grant Wood painting. And they made him the czar of all the rushes, as they called him, the head of the MPAA. And in 1930, they issued a series of directives called don'ts and be carefuls. That is, things that producers and studios should worry about in case they ran afoul of local censors. That wasn't really enforced until 1934 by Joseph Brynner, who was appointed as the head of the Production Code Administration. And he issued a code seal that was given to any film that obeyed all the rules. And they looked at everything from the story concepts to the release prints and the trailers and the costumes and the song lyrics, everything, to make sure the films adhered to the Production Code Administration's ritual of self-censorship. So that's a long way of giving an introduction to talking about how the rules were set up. And all of the letters back and forth were finally given to the Motion Picture Academy a few years ago, and I was given access to it to go through these. So I wanted to pick different things from different issues that were censored: political censorship, crime censorship, sexual censorship, innuendo censorship, dress, everything like that. And I tried to get a selection of films that were both well-known or well-known enough, and that illustrated these various issues. And that's what we have in the Naughty Bits.
Well, I'm glad you brought up a little bit of the history behind it for people who don't know any, about this history of what the production code was. Or, I mean, obviously it's a pretty deep history, which of course you can read about in not only the Naughty Bits, but in the Otto Preminger versus the Censors book that Nat wrote. And one thing that I always thought was interesting and that I wasn't certain on, maybe you can clear up for me, was what we know is pre-code, everything from 34 and going backwards before Joseph Breen came into the picture, when Will Hayes was the one in charge. Now they couldn't enforce the code, but they could make suggestions of what they should censor. So is there any indication as to why they didn't just begin to take charge like Breen did from much earlier? Not that I wanted it to be that way, but I couldn't help but wonder why he would only go so far as to make suggestions. Is there anything known about that?
It's all public relations. There were two reasons to hire Will Hayes. One of them was that he was a real conservative looking guy who they felt the people who wanted censorship in America would think was taking care of everything. He actually did nothing. The other important thing about Will Hayes was that he wasn't Jewish. And because most of whom were Jewish, wanted to make sure that there was a Goyish as a frontman for the whole industry, because they were afraid of a backlash of anti-Semitism, as in fact did happen with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and all of that. But the Hollywood was pretty much left alone, and Breen was called in. Breen was a Catholic layman, a very, very smart man and extremely diplomatic, and also a wonderfully garrulous Irishman who began to enforce the code and really brooked no difference with him. The code was incidentally set up by a couple of Catholic people, Robert Lord, who was a priest, and Martin Quigley, who ran the local trade paper, the Hollywood Reporter, and which is indicative of really Hollywood's morality, is really kind of a Catholic morality. And the way we describe it was the movies are all about Jewish Hollywood telling Protestant America how to be more Catholic. That's how the code was. But it was needed at the time. It was needed for years. And you're right. That period between 1930 and 1934, when the code wasn't enforced, gave us some of the most wonderfully ribald films you can imagine. American Tragedy, The Front Page, Night Nurse, Babyface, the story of Temple Drake. I mean, these things pushed the envelope to the point where the envelope was shredded.
Right.
And of course, they couldn't do it after about March of 1934.
Well, with any good film book, for me anyways, there's always discoveries to be made. And I counted that I had seen, where is it here? 38 of the 54 movies. But I watched a couple that really intrigued me. I mean, they all intrigued me, but some of the stories behind it. One that you just mentioned, the story of Temple Drake, which is a really, really good movie, I thought, and was one of the ones that really brought the production down hard, because, of course, it was exploring rape, and I suppose it could be interpreted as now as rape revenge, the way in which she gets back at her rapist and the main character and everything. But it was interesting that even in that film, they were pressuring them. They couldn't enforce the censorship, but it seemed as if they did make certain changes, even though they didn't really have to. Do I have that right?
You do. They alerted them to what was going on by simply saying, look, you're going to be banned in this state, in that state.
Right.
Canada had very strict censorship at various points.
I never knew that. Yeah. We always think the states.
Yeah. Well, they had to go for international distribution. I mean, Canada and Finland for some reason. But yeah, Canada's been back and forth with politics so much in the last couple of years, especially, but even before then. But it was a real contest to get films shown internationally. They had to be passed through customs and everything.
I didn't know that.
Novel Sanctuary, which is a very, very tough, rough novel. Faulkner wrote about this out. But all of these films, and by the way, I want to say it's a very funny book.
Oh, yeah.
Not just sarcastically funny, but some of these comments, you just wouldn't believe them. And they knew, the censors who were writing these letters knew what the story was. They were trying to be middle of the road, but you have to keep a straight face through a lot of it. I call the Naughty Bits a bathroom book because it has like 35 chapters and you can do one per visit.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. You know what I love so much about a book like this is you can. I read it all within about a week or just over a week, but then I went back and just read a couple of them just to refresh myself, because it is a bunch of different stories. So I don't know about you, but the first time around, maybe remembering, preparing for an interview, remembering all the details is a little harder unless you make notes. So when I went back to the to the story of Temple Drake, putting it together, I'm like, okay, they couldn't enforce it, but they could suggest things, but yet they still got it done. But like you said, all the, I didn't know that, or even think that the countries outside of the states even gave these filmmakers and producers a hard time. I thought it was just the states where this was done. And another interesting thing is we see when European films or foreign films came in, like Ecstasy, for example, another film I hadn't seen that I just watched last night, really also really enjoyed. And even then, that was another film that really put pressure on changing the production code. And that was a fascinating story as well about how they wanted to remake it years later, and all the appeals that went back and forth for years, and it never got a code. Even now, I couldn't find it on a streamer. You have to dig for it a little bit. But
you can go on YouTube. It's all there, 3 or 4 different versions of it.
Right.
Eddie Lamar and they all together, or is it Head?
Right.
Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah. But it seemed as though years later, like when a lot of those movies were coming in from Italy and Sweden, the Bergman films, those movies they were showing in the States. I mean, how did they get it through the production code then? Because I know later on there was success with Antonioni's movies in America, even though they showed a little bit of nudity and sexual situations. I don't know if you would happen to know.
Yeah, the independent distributors who handled the imported international films generally went to a small circuit of art houses, Paris in New York and some of the others, and they were less scrutinized by the general population, but they still had problems with customs occasionally. And when they went to go for a wider distribution of films, the Motion Picture Association would demand certain cuts or ask for them, and quite often the distributors refused. They found that they could get their money back by distributing the films in a select number of theaters and make the license fee back that they had paid to bring the film into America. But you still had films such as The Lovers, which was made by Louis Malle, which was heavily sued. The people who, in fact, a friend of mine, a man I work with, was the man, Nico Jacobellis, who was the fellow Jacobellis versus Ohio, where he was just the manager of the theater. And he was busted for showing The Lovers. It went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and that declared that motion pictures were art and that they couldn't be censored. There's also versus, well, there are a number of legal cases that we cover both in the Preminger book, but also in the Naughty Bits, about how censorship was broken. In fact, when the international film started coming in after World War II, it was a revelation that the production code was too tight, could not be revised, and that's what eventually led to its dissolution in the 1960s, because it had to change, and everybody knew it had to change, but it was incapable of changing. And so that's why when Jacques Valenti was appointed head of the Motion Picture Association in 1966, he began revising the production code. And by 1968, turned it into the current letter rating system that we have, which, by the way, has lasted longer than the original production code.
Yes. No, it certainly has. Are there any favorite Naughty Bit stories for you?
The ones that everybody's been asking me about are Casablanca and Gone with the Wind, which have been written about extensively elsewhere. Gone with the Wind was not just, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn, but it was also the treatment of African Americans and minimizing the notion of slavery. The thing of Gone with the Wind that a lot of people don't realize is, and there are no spoilers in this interview, because if you haven't seen Gone with the Wind by now, it's your fault. The scene where Miss Scarlet is molested on the bridge and Big Sam comes and rescue her from all of the other people who are encamping around there, while then Rhett and Ashley and the other gentlemen go out and roust these men from under the bridge. Well, this is the formation of the Ku Klux Klan. But they didn't call it that in the movie. They wouldn't dare, because the Klan was itself having something of a revival in the late 30s. And so you find some things which are minimized or changed. They actually use the N-word in Gone with the Wind originally, but that was taken out too after consultation with the NAACP for obvious reasons. It's a very complicated history, politically, socially, and there's a lot of, well, if you look at it this way, the production code was probably the first woke organization in America. in the days when woke actually was a compliment and not something
Right.
now that describes people who are afraid to leave the house.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to ask you something about that, but before I do, one thing I also didn't know was you had mentioned that certain films had scenes taken out that weren't restored till years later. Which was that only a minority amount of movies? I think Babyface you had mentioned things were taken out, not, but I never knew that because I know that from the script stage they would say you got to take this, that, or out. But of course, at the end of every memo was, of course, this all depends on the final cut. I never realized that. I thought whatever we were seeing was what everyone always saw from the time of release. But did that happen a lot, or was that just sometimes?
A lot of the films that were made between 30 and 34 were censored physically after they were shot when they went to re-release them after 1934. In order to get a code seal, they would have to make changes that weren't required when the film had been released. Public Enemy and Little Caesar are two good examples of that. When they went to release Little Caesar again after 1934, they had no problem getting a code seal. But Public Enemy was denied a code seal because it was seen as being more violent than Little Caesar. Little Caesar, they said, was a period piece, and that's the excuse that the code used to get it released. Public Enemy was just not allowed again. In Babyface, there's a story about Nietzsche. There's a discussion about Nietzsche. That went because he was considered to be a communist for some reason. I'm not sure how they made that connection, but they did. That wasn't restored until Turner acquired the film years later. One of the most notorious that's still around is A Streetcar Named Desire. The scene where Stanley and Blanche reunite on the stairwell. There were a couple of cutaways that were taken out because they were considered too sexual. Those were restored later on, and now Streetcar Named Desire is as Kazan intended it. So
I never knew that. Yeah.
Little bits.
I never knew that. I always, because I love the play as well, and I always knew that they naturally could only go so far with Stanley raping Blanche at the end, and so when you see the mirror smash, then her eyes close. I must be so naive. Here I am. I saw that movie for the first time 20 years ago. I always thought they were suggesting she passed out.
Yes. Oh, I'll correct myself. A few moments ago, I said Blanche. I meant Stella when they're on the stairs. He doesn't.
Oh, of course.
Go Stella.
Right.
You're right. In fact, if you single frame that mirror scene, you start to see Vivien Leigh in some moments of ecstasy.
Pleasure. Yeah.
Yeah, which you couldn't listen. If things have changed, you couldn't show a toilet in the bathroom. So when Hitchcock made Psycho and Janet Leigh is killed in the bathroom, they couldn't show the hopper.
Right.
When you had a kiss.
They could show the murder, but not the toilet.
Yeah, but think about that. At the end of Notorious, when Cary Grant is bringing Ingrid Bergman down the stairs and he kisses her, the screen's longest kiss.
Oh, yes.
Where they couldn't kiss for more than 3 seconds.
That's right.
By the way, it's a story of my life. But so Hitchcock kept on teasing the whole thing as they went.
They had to do little kisses, right?
Little kisses,
stop for 3, start again.
Right. Nibbled by ducks.
Unbelievable.
That's it. You couldn't show a married husband and wife sharing a bed.
Right.
It was the strangest things.
Oh my God. It's so extraordinary.
In East of Eden, Cal goes to the house where he hears that his mother is running a business. She is a madam. She's running a whorehouse. That's what it's like in the Steinbeck book. This traumatizes him. And then when he tells his brother goes off and eventually is killed in the war. It's a kind of a suicide by opposition. Well, the movie couldn't portray a whorehouse. And they also couldn't portray that the local sheriff was complicit in allowing the whorehouse to operate. So they made Cal's mother, played by Jo Van Fleet, who won the Oscar for her performance, simply be a woman who's running a gambling casino. And the sheriff was cleaned up. But darn well.
Of course, yeah.
But they had to take that out of East of Eden.
Wow, yeah. I always, from the first time I saw it, immediately recognized it as a brothel. So it's so funny how the littlest things would please them occasionally. Like, well, make it a gambling joint. But it's like, well, we all know what happens at even the gambling.
Of course.
Quote unquote. You
I'm
know,
shocked to find out there's copulation going on here. You know? One of the other films that I found really interesting was something like Bringing Up Baby, which is a screwball comedy, right? Well, and by the way, they missed this because it's still in the movie. At the beginning, Cary Grant is looking at the Brontosaurus and he's trying to figure out where the new bone is supposed to go. And his fiance, who's got glasses on, so we know it's non-sexual, trying to say, well, why don't you try it in the tail? And they said, we tried it in the tail last week and it didn't fit. That's an anal intercourse.
Of course.
That's still in the movie. So all of these things they didn't look at. And I'm going to hit you with another one in a wonderful, wonderful film called The Awful Truth, which is where Cary Grant and Eileen Dunn get divorced. The divorce is final at midnight. And of course, during the course of the film, they fall in love again. Well, they go into a country inn and they go into the bedroom and they close the door and we go into a clock, which is striking midnight, which means they just went to bed together and they're divorced. The code missed that entirely. So there's some little treasures to be held if you really watch the films to see how ingenious the directors and writers were of getting things past the code.
Yeah, well, that's one of the most enjoyable. Not always, but for me, some of the things that are the most enjoyable is watching that period and seeing the things that how they coded things or only suggested things. Billy Wilder and Hitchcock probably being two of the best. And they were also two of the biggest troublemakers, I imagine.
Yeah. But Hitchcock is famous for Psycho, when we have the scene at the beginning between Janet Leigh and John Gavin, who are having an affair in the middle of the day, which shows how desperate they were. The code says, you can't do that. They're two unmarried people. So Hitchcock says, well, we'll be happy to reshoot it. Send a representative over and show me what we can and can't do. The code never sent anybody over. So Hitchcock sent it right into the movie.
Oh my God. Yeah. That's another story I didn't know. And I was actually really surprised when I got to your Some Like It Hot chapter. I thought for sure that Some Like It Hot would have pages and pages of notes. And I was really surprised that they had no problem with it at all. And because all that's, I just wrote an article about it and mentioned your book in it. Mentioned my surprise.
Fourth paragraph. Yes. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. And I was surprised. I was really surprised. But then when you watch the film, this exploration of gender fluidity, and I imagine back then people didn't know, that would have just baffled them, or they would have just. The film is also so funny that it's easy to just enjoy it. But then when you really look at what's going on, but as you said, they were more lenient with comedies, I believe.
They were, and it was so because, well, let me put it this way: you could be a little more exploratory in a comedy. At the same time, you have something like, and this is not in that book, it's in the Preminger book, The Moon is Blue, which is about a woman who wants to keep her virginity. They came down on that because they didn't think sex was a suitable subject for a comedy. Well, by the time they made Some Like It Hot, it was. So it just shows how much wiggle room they had over the years, but not enough that they could really do it. And perhaps if they'd had the cut scene in Some Like It Hot, the scene where Daphne, Jerry actually comes out to Marilyn Monroe. They cut that scene because it was too much too soon. But the scene is available. You can, and not the film version, but you can see the script. Maybe push it over the edge. I don't know.
Oh wow! I'll have to look that up.
I'll send it to you privately.
Oh yeah, no, please do. I if I read that was a scene that got cut, I must have forgot. So
nobody talks about it. The film was such a success. Why go back into the archaeology? Right.
Yeah. No, I'll have to read that. Were any of these films? I imagine the answer is no on this. Were any of these first time watches, or had you seen them all?
I'd never seen Temple Drake before.
Oh, interesting.
We're dwelling on this film, but I don't think it's that good a movie. But it's amazing that it ever got made. I had never seen These Three before, which is the first version of the Children's Hour, and I'm trying to not go over the list in my mind. Just some of them are hard to catch. The great joy of writing these books is getting to watch these movies again and having an excuse to do so. Yeah, exactly. One thing with Temple Drake that I thought, because she was someone who had affairs with a number of men, they basically were saying that she was wrong or she was evil to do that, and she even thought that of herself, and the guy who was in love with her thought that.
And I thought that was the one thing I thought, oh, that doesn't sit well. On the other hand, I suppose you could interpret it that they're making her feel that way. And maybe what's wrong is it's more with them than her. I know that's a debate that goes on around the film with Diane Keating looking for Mr. Goodbar, which is a film I love, and that's a people look at it either as a warning for women to not sleep around, or the flip side of, well, why do women have to be so worried about getting raped just by socializing or having sex with more than one man?
Well,
you're
right. Yeah, they have to be seen in the context of the times, and whether a film is a moral statement or an immoral statement is really up to the filmmaker, in this case, Richard Brooks, who knows what he's doing.
Yeah.
I think left it kind of open, so it was a discussion starter, especially in a stage of transition. Sure. I'm looking down through the list of the films to see if there's any that I hadn't seen before, and I guess I'm such a film whore. The only one I haven't seen that nobody's seen was Convention City, which
you had mentioned that was one that got burnt to shreds because of how its content, which you wrote about in the book.
I've seen. Isn't this strange? I guess I have no life. I've seen everything here. Well, I mean, I've seen them. Yes, I've seen them, but I hadn't seen them before. No, well, Trouble in Paradise took me a while to find, but I did see that finally. Wonderful.
Oh yeah, that's great. The Lupish film.
Yeah, and again, moral, immoral people.
Right.
One of the great surprises was a wonderful film called Love Affair, which was 1939, made by Leo McCarey, who remade it in the 50s as An Affair to Remember. And I don't think he made it as well. You have Charles Boyer and Irene Dunne.
Yeah, I agree.
She's a kept woman. It let me realize the tension that these censors were under. These were not stupid people. These were not blue noses with blue pencils. These were people who were probably more well-read than the filmmakers they were censoring. They knew everything. They had read everything. And Love Affair, as we know, is about this tragic romance. But the reason that it had trouble was that Boyer was a kept man and Irene Dunne was a kept woman, and it was an illicit affair between them. Well, Joe Breen wrote this incredibly impassioned letter to Leo McCarey saying, "This is one of the best scripts I've ever read, but we can't let you make the movie." Talk about a man who was really caught in the middle. This was a fellow who really understood what these filmmakers were going through, but he had a job to do. Mind you, he liked doing the job, but he tried to help them work around. And that's what they eventually did with Love Affair, because there was so much suffering throughout. But that's what it took to get a film made that was at least different.
That was a big takeaway for me, even from reading your Preminger versus the Censors book, that these were smart people. They weren't just, like you said, people with blue pencils who just didn't know any better and were just enforcing. They were a lot smarter than maybe it seems.
Smarter than the filmmakers sometimes.
Yeah, no, that was a big takeaway for me as well. I just had one last question. It's something you touched on earlier with what people today call as woke, which is a word I really hate because of the way it's just been interpreted, and cancel culture, things like that. This is probably an obvious answer, but for people looking back on the production code, what can they learn here in the age of now, another sweep of censorship in all kinds of areas, do you think?
I'm not sure what they can learn by looking back in time at the production code and its restrictions. The problem is there were so many good movies made under the code that it's tempting to, the more restrictive we are, the better movies will be. But of course, movies didn't teach us much about real life. They taught us about fantasy. And that's something which was important at the time for escapism. But now we have to have the edge of reality. We have to confront certain issues. And so we need films that, in the right context and pitched in the right way to the right audiences, will tell us the truth. I mean, a Marvel movie, we don't expect to show us about the realities of indentured servitude or anything. I'm just doing a crash here. But some movies you really do have to have out telling us about what's going on, and we shouldn't be able to stop those. But again, the commercial marketplace does an awful lot about that now. The thing that's so ironic about all of this is we were trying to protect children and protect families. And now kids can go in their room and at the age of 4 and 5, pick up their cell phones and watch any movie that was banned 20 years ago. So
Right.
the important part is to raise your kids right and to know what you're getting to see. The production code, the letter rating system now teaches you what you're going to see, but the rest of the job is up to the parents and those who want to protect their children.
Right.
So that's, I think, the takeaway from the old movies and the new movies is we needed censorship at a certain time, but now we like to think society has advanced to the point where we can make our own decisions.
Right. Yeah. So, like, well said. Well said. For people who want to get the book, where's the best place for them to go?
The usual places, Amazon, of course, Barnes and Noble. I don't know if bookstores have them. It's from a new publisher called Sticking Place Books that's run by a scholar named Paul Cronin, who is the a biographer of Alexander McKendrick, and he decided, foolishly perhaps, to start a publishing house. He's a good friend. Just to drop a name, Arthur Penn introduced us, so he comes with a pretty good reputation. And The Naughty Bitch is available all over and everything and everybody. I stress it's a funny book, and it's also incisive. And so, Rob, thank you so much for letting me come and flog it on your podcast.
No, my pleasure. Anytime. And like I had said to Nat earlier, he's been on about monthly since December, talking about all the various fantastic books he's had. So I'll leave all those links in the description box below. I usually at this point bring out my Nat Segaloff shelf and show everybody, but since I'm not home right now because I'm out of town, you just go to the description box and check them out.
I've got copies of the entire. Yes, I do. I'm a whore. Okay, I'm a whore. The book coming out.
There we go. More fire.
This is out now, but the 50th anniversary of the Towering Inferno is in December, and so that's available. And I have 2 books coming out next year. So I have a great agent, Lee Sobel. If he's listening now, you better hit like, because this man has 7 or 8 books for me in the last 3 years.
Wow. Fantastic.
I'm very lucky.
What are the books coming out?
The one that is coming out from Kensington, the people who brought you the Scarface and the Exorcist books, it's next May. It's called the Rambo Report. And it's about the 5 Rambo movies and the 3 Rambo novels. It's the ultimate source, and it's done under the blessing of David Morrell, whose book First Blood in 1972 kicked off the Rambo craze. And he's an old friend, and he's very much behind the accuracy of the book. And another one, which Lee just sold the other day, so I can't discuss it yet, but it's going to come out next year too, I think. It's a major book about a major actor and a major director and their careers together. So,
fantastic.
A lot of typing.
Yes. A lot of work. You don't stop that. I love it.
I got to do something to put food on the table for my dog, who is now off somewhere sleeping.
Well, I'm looking forward to getting those, and I'm sure we'll have you back on to discuss them. And thanks again, Nat, and look forward to the next one.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. I want to thank all of my members on Patreon. If you're interested in becoming a member of my Patreon, head over to the link, patreon.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies for full details. Patreon is exclusive content that I create month in and month out. And as a subscriber, you are able to vote on polls and contribute to what I do on Patreon month in and month out. So head over to the link for full details. You can also leave a donation directly to my YouTube channel by pressing the thanks link, which you will find directly below the video frame. Just click on the thanks link and you can leave a donation there if you choose to. And lastly, if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing. It is absolutely free to do so by pressing the Robert Bellissimo at the movies logo. You will see it floating above my head in the top left corner to your top left. In just a second, just click on that and then click the bell in order to get a notification every time I release one of my new episodes. Also, click the like button and leave a comment below. Let me know what you think of this episode. Also, you can also share the episode. All of these things are what produce traction to my YouTube channel. So I appreciate you watching, and thank you again, and I will see you in the next episode.